Right, so now we were discussing about the security, and we discussed about different things like how to create the users, how to set the roles, and how to set the permissions, and object level security, data level security. We discussed many things. Okay, so coming back to the variables part, we will discuss about the session variables. So the reason I have scheduled these session variables after the security is basically the scenario that we will be working on, and we'll be trying to implement the session variables with respect to the security. So that's the reason. So if you have knowledge on security, then it make more sense to you. Okay, so now just to recap, the different variables we have a repository variables. Within the repository you have the static and the dynamic, and also we have session variables. Within the session you have the system, non-system. Okay, so we have two sets of variables, repository in the session, and within that we have independent like a static, dynamic, and in the system you have the, in the session you have the system and the non-system. So let's try to understand what is this session. So we already discussed like what is this repository variable. Repository variables are generic in the sense we use them for the generic purposes, like if I want to create a variable, if I would like to use the same variable across the different places in the reporting, then we use the repository. Okay, so repository variables are generic variables, and within the repository you have the static and the dynamic. Static is basically I want to define a variable, and I would like to manage the variable at times. That's my static. So dynamic is I would like the data to the variable is loaded dynamically on a time-to-time basis. In the sense, I'm using I create a variable, and I load the variable from a database. So which means as and when there is a change in the database, and my process should automatically identify, on a time-to-time basis, get the data from the database and assign the value to the variable. So that is a dynamic, which is the name itself says it's a dynamic which will get updated automatically on a time-to-time basis. Static is manual, where you go and modify the value. Dynamic is automatic, which is automated through the initialization block, where the initialization block is scheduled on a time-to-time basis. Based on the schedule, it will get executed. It will pull the data from the database, and it will assign the values to the variable. So based on the schedule of the initialization block, I always have my dynamic variables get feed from the database on a time-to-time basis. Okay, that's the part of the repository. So now the important part is the session. So how exactly the repository is different from the session? So by nature the repository is different from the session, because a repository is a generic variables, whereas if you look at the session is, it is a specific variable. When I say specific, session is user specific, and that's the core idea here. This is something that you need to understand. The session is user specific. So you can imagine in a way that anything or any variable that we create to capture something for a user, or something related to a user, something that is specific to users. So then we define under the session part. So that's the thumb rule. That's that's something that you can blindly follow. Okay, so session is a user specific. So anything that I would like to capture specific to a user, and I always define it as a session variable. Why not repository? Why I should really need to create it as a session variable is basically dynamic variable. As I said, they're generic. They are common instances. I don't know, when I create a value for the kind of repository variables, they are the common instances, which means, if I have a variable, the variable is common for every user that gets logged in. So it's generic, the value doesn't change. But by nature, session variable has its own specific set of variables for every user that logs in. In the sense, if I create two session variables, these two session variables can be different from a user to user. So if I have 1,000 users logged in, if I have 1,000 users logged into my OBIEE, these two session variables can have different data for all these 1,000 users. I mean, could be or may not be. I mean, it's not mandated that it has to be, but again, there is a provision where session is basically, what is a session? A session is a user specific stuff. Suppose you go to a website like an Amazon.com or some website. So when you're doing shopping, it manages your session, right? So now whatever the activities that you're doing, it will capture like okay, you viewed this item, okay, this is in the basket, and this is the last viewed items. So what is this? That is maintaining the state of your um, activity. So now, so whatever that you're doing, it's maintaining session. So at the end of the activity, probably you can check out and you can buy the things, right? The same way here, session is user specific thing. So it identifies the user. It creates something specific to a user. So let me give an example so that you can easily understand. Suppose, assuming that I have kind of a variable city. So when I say variable city is a variable which I would like to create, assuming. So can I create it as a session variable, or can I create it as repository variable? One thing, you can very well create it as a repository variable, no issue on that, and there is no hard and fast rule like this has to be created as a session variable or this has to be created as a repository variable. So I can create a variable city as a repository variable, provided the city for all the employees that is logging in is different. I mean, so it could be it is normal. So the city value will be there based on the data available in the database. If I am having a variable city, so I'll be querying a database. From the database, I'll be getting some data, so which is a generic. Okay, that is not specific to any user. But if my requirement is, I would like to get the data dynamically for every user, and my variable city should have the value in the variable specific to a user city location. In the sense, when I log in, suppose when I run my report, variable city should have a value London. Suppose when you log in, it should be some New Jersey or New York. So it depends, which means this the data that we'll be retrieving, the logic that we'll be implementing to get the data for the variable city is different. In the sense, we try to capture the city of that particular user so that we customize the reports user specific. Suppose if I am logged in, so it doesn't make sense to me if you show me the reports of US, because I don't belong to US, and I don't really manage those operations, right? So if I'm managing something in UK, then when I log in, if it's showing my report saying then it makes more sense to me. Okay, yes, these are the reports that I can find, the reports relevant to me, which means you can customize your reports or you can customize your dashboards depending on the user login. So that is, we call it as a session. So to customize my reports, to to manage or to maintain the reports to user specific, I can create as many variables as specific to the user, like variable city which I create, like I say country or email address or anything specific to the user which you think like it should change for user to maintain in our reporting and the dashboard. So you can create them under the session variable. So That is the major difference between the repository and the session. So I mean, don't worry about how do we get this value specific to the user, which we will discuss. But at this point of time, you have to understand that anything which is a generic, or anything that you think like it's a constant, or it's a common to anybody and everybody, that's a repository. So you need to put it as a repository variable. But if you think there is a variable which you would like to capture different value for the every user, you would like to capture different value for every user, then you define it as a session variable. Simple. Then that's it. Right? Okay. So that's on the session variable part. So let's look at what are the different types of session variables that we have. We have the system and we have the non-system. So system is basically it's predefined. System is predefined in the sense the variables are already defined. You already have the variables. So when you install the OBIEE, when the OBIEE is there, so within the OBIEE you have certain predefined variables that is already defined. Okay, so these are constant, so you cannot create them, you cannot delete them, you cannot I can say rename them. So which means within the OBIEE there are predefined system session variables. Predefined system session variables, they are already defined. So they kind of their OBIEE will provide like 10 variables or 20 variables or 30 variables. Those are constant in the sense those you cannot create a new system session variable. You cannot delete the existing one. You cannot rename the one. All you can do is you can use them and you can assign the values to it. So system session variables are predefined, which would like to maintain the state of your system or state of your user. So it will contain all these system specific details, who logged in and what time they logged in. So there's a certain number of variables that is available where by nature when you log in, so these variables are populated with the in the security framework. These variables are populated with the details of those login and details of those user. Okay, so similar to the system variable, non-system session variables are also user specific. Non-system session variables are also both, I mean, both system and non-system are user specific, but the system session variables are predefined and a non-system are the user defined. Non-system are the user defined. What does it mean by user defined? So it defined by user. So I mean, so predefined is basically you have some variables and you cannot do anything. All you can do is use those variables. That is a predefined. User defined is something you can create your own variable. I mean, so it is specific to user, but still it is specific to user, but you still have the luxury of creating your own variable. Okay, so by nature this is also user specific, but again you can define your own variable. You can create your own variable. Suppose say variable email address. So the email obviously is unique for user to user. That changes for user to user. So based on the user login, what you want to do is you would like to understand the email which is specific to this user, and I would like to use same thing, as a contact or something somewhere I would like to display. Okay, so non-system variable email is not a system variable, that is not predefined. So I can define something like a variable email which is a non-system, which is not part of the system variable, which is not predefined, that is defined by me, but I can still have my own data or my own user specific data. Those variables we call them as non-system session variables. Right. So if I look at the session variables and system and the non-system, system is predefined, which I have a predefined set of variables, and non-system is I don't have any predefined set. I can create a new variable as and when I need. Okay, so now what is that we are going to do is we are going to discuss this scenario with an example to identify uh, how exactly these session variables work. So before I actually go and explain a scenario, so I'll explain you something um, within the security, so that will give you a little idea of, like, how does my security kind of login mechanism works. Right. So whenever a user logs in, right? So whenever a user logs in, okay. Let me see here. So this is the user. So whenever a user logs in, so obviously the requests, especially when it comes to the analytics, which is the reporting. I'm not talking about enterprise manager in the console. So enterprise manager in the console request doesn't come to the BA server. So you need to understand these things. What is the role of the BA server? What is the role of the WebLogic? So all the requests that you do on the analytics will come here first. Suppose when you go to the HTTP localhost colon 7001 slash analytics, when you give username password, this user is not going to get authenticated with the WebLogic. I mean, the initial request will always go to the BA server. So when I receive the request in the BA server, so BA server is the one which is actually going to authenticate this user from the different patterns, depending on how you manage. So one of the security mechanism that we use is WebLogic realm. So this is the WebLogic realm, where that is one of the security mechanism that we are actually working. This is one thing. Okay. Now there is another option that we can use. So, see, there is different ways that we can get authenticate the user. So it's not mandatory that we have to use only one option. So, and I can also use my, what I can say is, any or LDAP tools. LDAP tools. Like an Oracle Identity Manager, or an Oracle Identity Manager, or Access Manager. So could be, I don't know, Microsoft Active Directory. So could be any of these tools. Okay. Or I can also use, it's my choice. Like, I can also use some other source. Okay. Now, so the important thing that we need to understand is it could be any of three. So probably we can use any of these three. So when my user logs in, so what is my user logs in with? My user logs in with the user and the password. Obviously, right? When in the login screen, what do you have? You have the user and the password where you log in with. Okay, now the request comes to the BA server, and this is where the BA server will actually route the request to the WebLogic unless you configure a third-party authentication. Okay, if you don't configure any third-party authentication, what it will do is it will go to the WebLogic. It will see the user that I have logged in is available in the WebLogic or not. If the user that I have logged in is available in the WebLogic, then it will authenticate the user. So what do I say, like, and how do I authenticate the user? How do I say that the user is authenticated? So what my BA server do is my BA server will make a query to the WebLogic, and based on the WebLogic, it will pull the details from the server. It will pull the details from the WebLogic, which is user specific details. Okay, and it will assign those values to the system session variables. So now in BA server, you have like system session variables, user, display name, log level. Okay, I mean, I'm just to name few. So I have a user, I have a display name, I have a log level. In the sense, these are the system session variables. Okay, so inside the BA server, I have the system session variable. So what is my authentication do is like when my user logs in with the username and the password, the request goes to the WebLogic server, and within the WebLogic, I have a user available, right? So I have a user available. It will verify if the user is available or not, and if the user is available, what it will do? It will get the details of this user and it will assign the values to the system session variable. So my system session variables is assigned with the results that is retrieved from your WebLogic. So that is an automated process. You don't really need to do anything. So when you log into the user, that's where my kind of an automated process within the OBIEE will take care of authenticating the user. So I'm just trying to explain you what happens internally. So there is nothing that we need to do in this process because it's already pre-built process where a user logs in, the request goes to the WebLogic, and from the WebLogic it will get the user details. Once we have the user details in, and those user details will be assigned to the uh, kind of a system session variables. When my system session variable is assigned with the user details and a login is successful. Suppose if my um, system session variables is not assigned with the values, then a login is not created. Suppose which means if my system session variables are empty, they are not assigned with any values, which means invalid user. In the sense, when a user logs in, if goes at the authenticates, if there is a user available, we pull the data from the user and we assign it to the user details. Then I say user is authenticated. Okay, when I go and get the data, and if the user doesn't exist here, then I don't assign any values to the variables. When I don't assign any values to these variables are empty. When these variables are empty, then I can say the user is not authenticated. So that's where we talk about um, that's where we talk about the security part. So which is specific to the variables. So having said that, so the authentication process so happens automatically and by assigning the values to the users. So that is where that's a general process which we do not really involve. So that is an automated process which happens where it will look at the user. So now what we can do to understand what we can do to understand the scenario and create our own scenarios, basically instead of authenticating the user from a WebLogic, what I can do is I would like to authenticate from a database table. I would like to authenticate my user from a database table where we capture the data in the database table where the database table will will have the details of the user, suppose in a username, all these required details. That I create a table in the database where I provide all these details. So now inside my BA server authentication process, what I do is I simply go to this database table, and from this database table retrieve the data, and once the data is retrieved from this table, and I'll assign them to the variables. I'll assign them back to the variables which is of type what? System variables. So I'll go and get the data from this database and assign the values to the system variables, and I call this as system session variables. So this is the default authentication process which I would like to override with the by creating my own process by introducing a database. So now my BA server, instead of going to the WebLogic, what it will do, it will go to the database table, and from the database table it will pull the data. So how does my kind of authentication process will get triggered? How does it will go to the database table? So basically what we actually do is we have the initialization block inside the session variables also. So if you remember, we have initialization block inside the repository variable. So what is the initialization block inside the repository variable does? The initialization block inside the repository variable is basically it is going to get executed on a time to time basis. Suppose if I say initialization block inside the session variable is basically this will also get executed, but again the only difference between the execution of this initialization block within the repository and this initialization block inside the session is basically initialization block within the repository will get executed on a schedule basis. Suppose say depending on what schedule you define, suppose every hour, like an every day, or so it depends like how you define your schedule. So if you define the schedule as every 2 hours, then it will get executed every 2 hours. Okay, so if you but in the initialization block that is defined inside the session, if you define the initialization block within the session, so the session initialization block, what it does is it will get executed on a on the user login. So every time a user logs in, the initialization block will automatically get executed for the specific user. Every time a user logs in, initialization block will automatically get executed for the user. In the sense, the trigger for the execution of the initialization block is what? User login. So when you log in, the initialization block will automatically get executed. Initialization block will automatically get executed. That's where the difference between the initialization block of the repository at the same time initialization block of the session. So initialization block of the session will get executed automatically whenever a user logs in. So now inside this initialization block process, because we know that whenever a user logs in, this will get executed, right? So inside this process, we will try to go and get the data from this database table. We write our own logic to pull the data from the database table that is available in the database and assign it back to the variables. So now simple, the user login is success or failure depends on whether my system variables are assigned with the values or not. Okay. All right, so I'll come back again because I don't know if I'm really making much sense here, because unless you see it how exactly this looks like, so you don't realize it. So we'll quickly look at the session variables and the options that is available here, so that you can easily understand, and we can come back and we can discuss again. So I'm logging into my repository. Right. So if I look at here, if I go to the manage, if I look at variables, right? So this is what we're discussing about. So I have my initialization block for the repository and I have the variables for my repository. That's already there. Now here we are talking about the session because we just would like to use my session variables. Now if I look at the session, obviously session has its own initialization block. If you see, there is something called kind of a time, so which is like which is user specific. Okay, it's an automatic process. You don't really need to trigger it. So it's automatically get triggered whenever a user logs in. These are the important things that you need to remember. So suppose they may ask you a question like, okay, how can you configure the initialization block of the user? So when exactly the initialization block of the session will get executed? What is the schedule? So you should be in a position to understand there is no schedule for it. You cannot schedule initialization block of the session where it's automated. Whenever a user logs in, it will get triggered irrespective of the user. So that is the reason if you have more initialization blocks, then there is a lot of execution that happens in the backend. So you need to see that if it is required, then only you create the initialization block of the session, because all of these initialization blocks will get executed whenever a user logs in. So that may cause a performance issue. Okay. So going back to the variables, like in the session variables, you have the system and the non-system. If you see here, I have my system variable and I have non-system variables within my variables. So if I select the system, if I right click, see, these are all the system variables that I have. See, these variables are constant. When I say constant, I cannot really define my own variable. All I can do is I can make use of these variables. That's it. Simple. I cannot define, I cannot create my own variable here. Suppose if you say whether you say user or a group or a role, like a log level, description, display name, time zone, skin, anything that you say. So this is like, I can only use it in the sense I cannot delete it, I cannot add it, I cannot rename it. All I can do it, I can assign values to it. Which means my idea is, I cannot really assign like, and I cannot really say user and assign a value like assign into my static variable. As I told you, except the static variable, which is a dynamic repository variable, system session variable, non-system session variable. All these three variables should get assigned through an initialization block. So you have to have an initialization block to assign the values to these variables, which is nothing but kind of a dynamic, okay, where these will get assigned automatically. You don't really need to go and manually manage them. So these are all the different system session variables I have, which I have defined here, and I can assign values to these system session variables. So as I said, I cannot really go and assign the value to it because I have to have an initialization block. Without the initialization block, I cannot really assign. So that's one thing that you need to remember. So, and contrary to what my system session variables, if I go to the non-system, if we say new, then I can create my own variable. So non-system session variables can be defined with my own names. I can define any non-system session variables of my choice. System session variables is something that I need to define, or then I need to choose from the existing variables what I have, and I can assign the values to it. Okay, right. So having said that, so what is that I'm trying to implement is I'm trying to implement a mechanism where I want to authenticate the user. So I'm going back here. So when I go back here and I explain you, so I have my system session variables. So now what is that I want to do is I would like to assign the values to these variables. When I assign the values to these variables, every time a user logs in, what happens? It means a session is created. Okay, when a session is created, obviously the user is logged in. So now I would like to assign the system session variables the values from the database table, then assigning it from the WebLogic. Yes, I mean they are something similar to the keywords, something like a database. You have like a date, right? So that is defined by the database. You cannot really define your own variable like a date. So it's already being used by the database. I mean, even if you take any programming language, every programming language has its own variables or its own keywords kind of stuff. So you cannot really use them. Same way here, they are just defined and they are specific to OBIEE. You cannot really use them. All you can do is you can simply assign. So what is that we're trying to do is we're trying to assign the values to these variables. So by default, if you don't do anything, it will get authenticated through the WebLogic. It will get assigned. We don't even see that process because that's a built-in process. So what is that I want to do now? I don't want to go through this process. So whenever a user logs in, what is that I want to do? I want my initialization block inside the BA server should get executed, and this should go to a database table and pull the data from this table based on the user and the password. Based on the user and the password, it will go and get the user details, and whatever the user details that it will pull from the database, it will assign those back to the system variable. Now my system variables are assigned with the values, then the user will get authenticated. If there is no user in the database table, there is nothing that we assign. When we don't assign anything, my system variables are empty. When they are empty, obviously the user will not get authenticated. So that's how. So let's for this now what we need is we need a database table. So what I did is I created some sample database table which is kind of with the details of the user, whatever that I want to assign, right? So I just created this table with the details of the user that I would like to assign. So let me go to this table. think I also have some script. Okay, so this is a kind of a table that I'm talking about. So I'm creating a table name with name user underscore AUTH. You can give any name, doesn't matter, just some random name that I've given. So I mean, I'm intentionally creating a few columns, and it's up to your choice what columns you use. But I can make sure that we assign some of the values that is required inside our repository, something like, so you see there's like around 20 variables available. You can pick any of the variables, user, group, role, I mean whatever the values that are display name, description, log level. So those simple things that I've chosen out of this. Okay, so you can choose all of them also, but again, as long as you have the values to assign or something to. So to make it simple, I've chosen only like 5-6 columns from this list, and I created a table. And so this is my table which I created: username, display name, log level, group name, password. So password is not there in the list. Password is not there in the list of the system session variables. If you see, there is no password in the system session variable because you don't store any password here. So, but again, so I've kept this password here in my table because I need to authenticate, right? I need to authenticate with the username password by comparing. So I create a table with name user underscore AUTH with different columns, and assign the values to these variables. Okay, so into the table, what is that I do is I simply insert a couple of users. So I can user A, user B, user X, user M, something like that. Right. So I have a table created, and I have assigned the values to these tables. Okay. So now what is that I would like to do is I'll just show you like what I'm talking about. So I'll go to my BA sample. And my user is user underscore AUTH. And I have the data here where I have the user A, and my display name is user A, and I have the log level 2, and this is a group, and this is a password. Right. So I mean, I created a couple of users. Let me, and if you think I can delete these users also. Okay, so I'm talking about a user table which is user underscore AUTH, which has no data here. So what is that I would like to do is I would like to first of all create these users inside the table. So now see, I mean, the table is already created. I'm not going to create this table again. If you want to create it, you can drop the table. You can simply execute this table. So assuming that I have a couple of users available here, which if I would like to insert these users, and I can simply say, see, four users are created. I say commit. Now I go back here. I can see that the users, which is 4 users available in my database table. So I have 4 users available in my database table. All right. Now, so what is that I would like to do is I would like my initialization block. So my initialization block should go and get the data from this table and simply initiate it. So now inside my initialization block, what is that I would like to do? I would like to write a logic in a way that my the request goes to this table, and from this table it will pull the data, and it will assign the values back to my system session variable. So I go and create my initialization block. I can say new initialization block. Within my new initialization block, I can say init underscore don underscore variable. So you can give any name xyz. So if you observe one thing here, my initialization block of the session doesn't have any schedule. So it has no schedule. It's simply so without the schedule, all I have is on data source and the variable target, but I don't see any schedule. But again, if you open the initialization block of the repository, you see a schedule, right? Now, so I have init underscore divine underscore variable. This is something, the name I have given to my initialization block, and I'm talking about a data source where I would like to connect to my source, where I would like to pull the data from the database specific to the user. So in the sense, in this logic, in the data source logic, what I would like to do is I would like to connect to my table, which is available in my user BA sample. So I can make use of the same connection which I have. Okay, and all I can do is I can simply pull the data from this table based on the username password. So what I'll do is I say edit data source. I would like to assign a connection pool. So when I try to use a connection pool, it doesn't show me any connection pool. The reason being is, the connection pool that I already have here, I have used this to import this table. So for the session variables, it doesn't really use the same connection pool, because session is, whenever a user logs in, a connection is used. Suppose if I have 1,000 users logged in, the 1,000 connections are used, right? So basically my connection pool is something, which is extensively used for the session initialization blocks, because if 1,000 users logs in, 1,000 connections are created. So that is the reason I don't really want to use the same connection pool which I'm using for this data, because if the connection is full and there is no empty connection, there is no free connections, my request will not get processed. Okay, so to avoid that, what I will do is I will simply create a copy of this connection pool. So copy paste, I can copy paste it. Say BA sample underscore, I can give any name. I'll just give it as a session. Okay, I've created one more connection pool, which is my BA sample underscore session, which I dedicatedly use it for the purpose of authentication. Okay, so BA sample underscore session. So I go to my manage and I say variables, and inside the variables of the session, so I can say new initialization block, init underscore divine underscore variable. So I can go to my edit data source, and now I browse my connection pool. So this is my BA sample underscore session. Right, so now I would like to run my query, and what my query is like, and I would like to pull my data from the database. Say this is my database, right? So I would like to pull my data from the database, like username, display name, log level. So I would like to write a query. So before I actually go and write a query here, let me write a query to pull this data from this table. So I can say select. So what is the columns that I have? Like, and I have a couple of columns. That so if I look at it, I can look at it from here. Select username, comma, display name, comma, log level, comma, group name, comma. I don't need a password in the select. I'm just selecting it. Select these columns from what? From table what? User underscore AUTH. Okay, that is my user underscore AUTH, where username equal to, see, there is a default variable that is available, which is a user. So, and there is a default variable that is available, which is a password also. So what does a password will have, and what does a user have? So whenever a user logs in, right, you have what I can say is, see, if you look at the enterprise manager, suppose say, let me log into my analytics. I'll show you. It's a framework that we don't do anything. It's a framework. So whenever I log into my analytics using this screen, so there is an option for me to enter, right? So what is the option that I have here? I have the username and I have the password. So by default, whatever the value that you give here and whatever the value you give here is captured as the variables internally. So this is something captured as a variable, which is a user. This is captured as a variable password. So that is the reason what is that I'm using colon user, which is like a variable. So I'm just trying to use the value of the user. I'm trying to use the value of the password, in the sense whenever I log in with a username password, I can remember them and I can store them in two variables, which is by default by the framework. You don't do anything. If you say colon user, which means you are trying to get the user that the user logged in with, password, the password of the user. So to check if my query is working fine, so I'll replace this colon user with a default user, suppose say user A. To check my password is working, I would like to replace my password with my user A, because my username password is one and the same. So I say select and I run. Now this query is working. So which means except can I know. So I'm confident that the query is working. So I simply replace it with a colon. So now if I use the colon, if I run the query, it won't work, because these are the dynamic parameters, right? These colon user colon password will get replaced dynamically in the runtime based on the user and the password. So if I log in with user A, then my user A will be the user, and if I log in with the user A as a password, then user A will be my password. So like that, now I have the username and the password. So this is my query which I'm using here. So what I will do is I'll use the same query inside my initialization block. So this is my initialization block, where now I have my query. So select username, display name, log level, group name, from user underscore authenticate. This is my table where username equal to user, password equal to colon password. So now I cannot test it because I have colon user and the colon password as the parameters. I say okay. Now I'm selecting my details based on my user and the password. Okay, so now I say edit target. And what is that I'm doing? Whatever the values that I pull from this query dynamically, right? So username, display name, log level, group name, I would assign those values to my variables. So I can say add new. So what is my variable? And see, I would like to store my username as the user. So this is a system session variable. I would like to assign the username as the user. So whatever the username that I retrieve, I'll assign it back to the user. Okay, so user session variable has a special purpose. Are you sure you want to use this name? So you see what it says is it's a system session variable, right? So it is created for a special purpose. Now when I say special purpose, this has its own value. So say this is a system session variable, right? So assign the value to the system session variable. When you are assigning the value to a system session variable, it will always tell you like, okay, system session variables are created for a purpose. Do you want to assign the value, kind of stuff? Okay, so I assign the value to the display name. So now how do I know like what is the value like for this? See, if you want, you can go and go back to the system session variable, right click and note down the actual names for these. So these column names could be anything. End of the day, all I really care about is the value in there. Okay, so some column names I give in the same name, some column names could be little different, but doesn't matter. So you don't worry about these column names. Suppose I have given a username, but does my system session variable is the username? No, just a user, something like that. Okay, so my display name is could be same. Okay, and I can say log level. Okay, I can also have something like a group. Okay, so one thing that you need to remember is whenever you give like group will it will automatically prompt. If it is not prompting, it means it's not a system variable. Okay, so this is my query and this is my target with a list of users available, and I can say okay. It says it's already exists. Okay, init underscore session underscore variable. Okay, so I check in. Okay, so this is my session variables which I can assign the values to my session. If you look at the session, so these 4 variables are actually assigned with the values. These 4 variables are actually assigned with the values. Okay, so now what is that I would like to do is, since I have set up this thing, so what I would like to do is I would like to log in with my session variables. Like suppose like these variables. Suppose I have my user A and my password could be user A. So I can give my user, which is my user A. My password is also user A. Just sign in. No, I got signed in. So I got signed in with the user A. So which means, this is working. So now where are we authenticating from? We are authenticating from a database table because we have the user A available in my database table. See, user is available. Suppose you may be thinking like, maybe it's taking any user. So these are the 4 users, right? So let's take another user which is not available here. Suppose say user Z. Okay, assuming that I'm trying to log in with the user Z. So I go here and I say I log in with user Z or user Z. It's an invalid user, which means this is not actually allowing because this user doesn't exist. So what I will do is I'll go here and I'll insert this user. We'll insert this user and see if it is actually, after the insertion, does it work or not. We'll understand. So now I say run this statement. Okay, this is inserted. So my row user Z is inserted. If I go back to my table and if I say refresh, I see now another user Z. Okay, now I go back and I say I log in with user Z. See, now I'm able to log in. So which means what we are doing is we are authenticating the user from the session variables. So that is where system session variables is all about. What do you mean here? Like, what is the system session variable here? See, remember, whenever I'm logging in, right? Whenever I'm logging in, based on my user, based on my password, could be anything. Based on my, at least with this authentication, I'm authenticating because I am used by both the username and the password. So I log in with my username and the password. Based on the user, I'm getting the values and assigning the values to the session variable. So where if I assign the value to the session variable, say session is created and the user is logged in. So that is only for the authentication purpose we are doing. But again, if I really use this for other purposes, like where do we go? We actually go to this non-system session variables where we can capture the other details also. Suppose the city that the user belongs to, or I can use the reference of the user because I'm logging in with the user ID, right? So based on that user ID, whatever the data that I can pull from any database, and I can simply create those variables like in a city, email address, country, XYZ, ABC, department, anything. So which is user bound or user specific. Now I can create all those variables and dynamically I run my initialization block, and within the initialization block I write a query to pull the data from this table where user equal to colon user. So which means I'll pull the data based on the user that is logging in. So what I will do, I'll pull all the data that is specific to this user and whatever the value that I get from the database, and I assign the data to the variables that I've defined here. So every time a user logs in and a new session is created for himself, and within his session, and he will have his own username, right? So the data that is belong to this user will get retrieved, and the values are assigned to the non-system session variables for that particular user. So I can use the same variables anywhere inside my reporting, wherever that I would like to use them to dynamically display my data. Like I can use them in the report filters. So variable city. So my variable city will have the different value based on the user. So whenever I log in from London, when I run the reports, because my variable city is London, then when I say kind of run the reports or look at my dashboards, I can see all the data that is related to London. So if you log in from New York, then your city belongs to New York. So your OBIEE will automatically identify you as a user, and based on the dynamic query, it will identify from the database table saying, select city from um, kind of a customers where are users where username equal to colon user, which is your username. So what it will do, it will get your username, a user city for your username from the users table, assuming. So now what happens, then the variable will have the value that is in New York, because that against your username, and in the users table the city is New York. So that way, one single variable, which is a variable city, can have different values depending on the user that logs in, because we get this data dynamically from tables by running the dynamic queries. So that's how my kind of session variables work, and where we discuss about the session variables as two things, which is a system session variable as well as the non-system session variables. So system session variables are predefined with a set of variables available. Non-system session variables are user defined, where we can define our own variables. Okay. Any questions here? Anything that you don't understand?
Dinesh, Dinesh.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Like, you show the connection pool, right? Why the BA sample shows up on the session?
See, because if you look at any connection pool, right, that's a good question. But again, see, if you look at the session, right, the session has its own set of limitations. Suppose the maximum connections. So using this connection pool, you can only kind of make 10 connections. Suppose if I make 100, you can make only 100 connections. If there is already 100 connections already open, and you cannot open another connection. It's very common, right, in applications. You have that database connections where you open the connection and you close the connection, and you can set the maximum connections. So in the enterprise application, so there is a concept called a connection pool available. So connection pool is an object that maintains and manages the connections to the particular application. So using this connection pool, what is that I'm doing? I'm connecting to this database. So what is I can do is I can configure certain settings in the connection pool. Based on the connection pool, my BA server will decide whether it has to open a new connection or not. So if I already exhaust 10 connections, it won't open a new connection. It will wait for the one of the connections to close, so that it can allocate that connection. So the reason it is not showing up this one is because by nature the authentication, the users, the sessions are more, because I may have like 100 users, right? I may have 1,000 users, business users. Now if I use the same thing, same connection pool, my 10 connections will get exhausted within a minute, because at any time, like 10 users may be logged in. So what happens now, my reporting application, I don't really get any connections to query the database and get the data from the reports. So for my reports, I don't have the proper connections available. That is the reason earlier versions, in the previous versions, there is only one connection pool it uses. But again, in the latest versions, what they did is they have identified this issue, and they realized, so you cannot really use the same connection pool for the session. So that is the reason for the session variable, it will create the new connection. So suppose say, now if I go here, I can define my own connection, suppose it's 100 or 1000 or whatever. So this is dedicated connection pool. Even if the connections exhausted, so it may not let the new user to log in, but at the same time, the report execution will continue to work. Whoever has already logged in, right, they'll continue to execute the reports, because this connection pool is having some connections to open. This connection pool is already exhausted because more than the number of users that has logged in. So that is the reason, by nature, they have defined this kind of different process. There's nothing.
Thanks, Dinesh. Makes sense.
Yeah.